Welcome to our Playwell podcast. My name is Sherry Morgan and I'm Director of Projects at Play Scotland, the national organisation for play. Recently, the child's right to play has come into firm focus with the incorporation of the UNCRC into Scots law. So today, our Chief Executive, Marguerite Hunter-Blair, speaks to Dr. Naomi Lott, an expert on the child's right to play.
Dr. Naomi Lott is a John Fell Research Fellow at the Bonavero Institute of Human Rights at the University of Oxford and is also a lecturer in law at University College London. Welcome, Naomi, to our podcast series at Play Scotland.
Thank you very much for having me.
Naomi, we have actually never met in person, I don't think, but we met online a good 4 years ago, I think it might have been, when you were studying for your PhD at Nottingham University. And it was a delight to work with you then. And your research was around Article 31, the child's right to play. And last year in June, it was a very exciting time for us in Scotland. We were hosting the IPA Glasgow Conference, World Conference, with delegates from 41 countries. And straight after that wonderful event, a number of our delegates were racing down to England for the launch of your book, which was based on the research that you did for your PhD. So what I'd like to do is just ask you to tell us a wee bit about your research, about the book, and what the highlights in the book are for you.
Yes, of course. So the book is based on my doctoral research that I did at the University of Nottingham, funded by the ESRC. And really the idea of the book was to provide an in-depth analysis of the child's right to play. The book's called The Right of the Child to Play from Conception to Implementation. And really it starts off by giving a brief overview of why children's play is important, which of course your listeners all understand and are advocates for already. But looking at both the intrinsic and the instrumental value of the right to play. Understanding that whilst the instrumental role of play in children's lives shouldn't be the focus, actually, when we're looking at making impact from a policy perspective, that is what policymakers are looking for. It then looks at grounding our understanding of the right to play and how it should be implemented in the legal history over how it was developed, who suggested it should be brought to the table, and what the drafters of the Convention on the Rights of the Child envisaged for this right. I then go on to identify the key challenges around implementing the right to play for children, what they find as the factors that hamper their enjoyment for play. But that's very much based on kind of doctrinal research, looking at the outputs of the Committee on the Right of the Child. I looked at over 500 of their outputs and did a kind of textual analysis to look at how and where they were referring to the child's right to play. I then outlined the scope and content of the right, and that sounds kind of very legal terminology. It basically looks at, beyond simply having the right to play included in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, what does this mean for states? What do they actually have to do in order to implement the right? And then I ground that within a multi-case study looking at the UK and Tanzania. This is where your experience came into play so helpfully, understanding the processes around, in the Tanzanian context, incorporating the right to play within national legislation. And then for both countries, looking then at the challenges and opportunities that are faced when trying to achieve kind of buy-in from local and national government.
Naomi, it's so interesting. And of course, it's incredibly topical in Scotland at the moment. The 16th of January 2024 is a big date for us now in Scotland in the children's sector, when UNCRC was adopted or into Scots law. And so the right to play is now a legal requirement in Scotland. And there will be various regulations and guidance and provisions around that, a lot of which will come out in the course of this year. But I know that you're engaged in a really interesting piece of work at the moment about looking at providing a framework around implementation And I know it's a work in progress, but I wonder if you'd like to share some of your thoughts about that with us.
Yes, of course. So I have a working paper at the moment that is based on this PhD research, which is evidenced in the book, that highlights 3 factors, 2 of which are commonly referred to in the play field, time and space, and then also this factor of acceptance rather than permission, which is often used as necessary for implementing the right to play, and actually how these 3 concepts can be used to as almost umbrella concepts for bringing in the scope and content that I outline in chapter 5 of my book in a way that's accessible for policymakers. And so I've got a working paper that does that already, very much based on the research I've done. This project now, which is funded by the John Fell Fund, hence my job title, is called Developing the Framework for the Implementation of the Right to Play. And what we're doing in this project, we are working with approximately 100 children aged 3 to 18, asking them probably what we already know in terms of asking them what they want, what stops them from playing, what they want to support their play, but really as a tool to test, I suppose, the framework that I've developed so far, and to ensure that the doctrinal research, the historical research, and the kind of adult-focused empirical research that I've done actually matches up with what children are saying. And in this project, we're working with, as I said, 100 children, but from a variety of different backgrounds. We've got kind of schools are our gatekeepers. And we're working with schools kind of in small villages that are very isolated, very rural. We've got villages that are in kind of schools that are in towns and also in cities and in suburban environments, because we're very aware that children have very different experiences, a lot of which is based on their individual context, whether that's in their locale, but also their personal context. And so we've got, for example, some more focused on academic achievement schools. So, for example, like grammar schools or fee-paying schools, where there is a lot of pressure on children to academically achieve to their best ability, and other schools that would have more of a kind of a holistic approach to the child. That's not me wanting to be critical of the others, but you can see how the difference in focus might be, and then also how that then impacts on the child. So that's the current project. And the idea out of both of these and a future project, which I'm happy to discuss in a moment, will be to be able to arrive at something akin to the Lundy model of participation, which has been used globally now to understand the content of the child's right to participation and to be heard, Article 12, the UNCRC, in a very accessible way, so that lots of stakeholders can pick it up and implement it in their area of work, whether that's looking at governments or healthcare or education sectors as well.
And that's really interesting, because I know that the UNCRC implementation unit in government here did look in detail at the Lundy model as well. And for anyone who doesn't know what we're talking about Laura Lundy, Professor Laura Lundy, based at Queen's University, Belfast. And she has a model of participation. And before that, it really was Roger Hart's latter participation. I think that was the kind of dominant framework for children's participation. But I think, as you say, there's a lot to be gained from looking at Laura Lundy's model, and it has been widely adopted throughout the world.
Yeah, absolutely. So the idea is to develop something that will be as useful, but focusing specifically on the right to play. Now, of course, understanding the right to play and implementing the right to play requires looking at the convention as a whole. So things like the Lundy model come into play there. And that actually reminds me of another project that I'm working on at the moment, which is developing an edited collection that focuses on the interdependence of the rights within the convention, and using play as the lens to look at that issue. Because actually, you know, the Convention of the Rights of the Child talks about children's rights to education, healthcare, their environmental rights. It has implications for digital environments and how we understand the right to play in the digital context. and also specific groups of children that have unique challenges in realising their rights. So we have a chapter, for example, on refugee rights, a chapter, for example, on disabled children, all looking at how we fulfil their convention rights, but through the lens of the right to play. Really, the goal in there is to push the right to play almost up with the general principles of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, to say, actually, look, if we implement the right to play, we're implementing all these other rights in the process. And if we don't implement the right to play, we cannot fully implement these other rights as well.
So I think you're articulating what Play Scotland is striving for. I think you're articulating it really well, Naomi, because that is a concern that I have. You're quite right. There is an interdependence between all the articles. And I think one of the challenges for us in Scotland will be trying to make sure that there isn't a hierarchy of the rights emerging very quickly, where play might get lumped in with education or health or somewhere else as an add-on. And I feel very much like you do that actually it is almost a fundamental principle that without it being realised, then none of the other rights are fully realised. But it's making that case, and that's why we are so delighted with researchers like yourself looking at these different models, different frameworks, because it hasn't been done before. So it's exciting and pioneering, but there's a huge pressure if we don't get it right that we're missing a golden opportunity that might not come our way for a long time. And if it settles down in a particular format in Scotland, that then might get adopted somewhere else. So no pressure, but we are really trying to get it right. So we welcome a lot of the work that you're doing. We chatted earlier before we started the podcast about family time and family life and the balance with work life as well. But as a mum of young children, how does your work, do you think, influence what you think about the child's right to play? Do you think you are a more playful mum because you understand so much the importance of play in children's development?
I find as a child rights academic and a parent that it's a real struggle. And I know in theory how everything should be. In practice, it's really hard. And I think that's just the reality of it. And something that is worthwhile bearing in mind and not putting too much pressure on parents. I mean, in an ideal world, we would have a system that fully supported parents doing the best job that they possibly can in child rearing. And I'm working on a paper with Professor Jonathan Herring at the moment that looks at what the state should be doing to support parents in their child rearing responsibility. And part of that through the lens, in a child rights approach to parenting, what do we mean? What should the state be doing? In terms of personally in my own life, and in the process of doing this research, when I started out on the PhD, just a few months into the PhD, I was pregnant with my first child. And so a year later, here I was picking up the PhD again, but this time with a little baby in arms. And actually, I found it incredibly helpful for being able to understand theory that I was reading. Then why is play important? How does it help them develop? And watching it in action at the same time with my little toddler. Now he's 8 years old, and the play looks very different. And I think in many ways requires different skills and time from us as parents to support, and also then juggling that across 3 children now at various ages with their different needs. And I think one of the things that I struggle the most with is balancing a desire. I talk about it in my book. It's something that we need to address, the scholarization of childhood, and balancing this desire to ensure that my children have all of the tools that they possibly will need in their belt as they enter into life, with good education, a good knowledge of life skills. So, for example, going to Scouts and brownies and rainbows, and learning the skills that are not covered in school, but really important for understanding how to live or be resilient in the world that we live in and are going to live in as they grow older. And And of course, all the other extracurricular clubs. And also finding time to just support complete free play. I think on a practical level, what we've instituted more at home is making sure that weekends aren't busy. My son still plays football on a Saturday morning, but then trying to just be at home as much as possible, because that's the prime time for them to get their toys out or spend a whole afternoon building a den, which then, of course, you've got the problem of, can we keep it up overnight? Well, we'll have to have breakfast on the dining table, so it's going to have to go down at some point, and all those fights that inevitably go into play. But yeah, it's a difficult balance. And looking at how to support parents in this, I think, is really key to having a better implementation of the child's right to play. And I think one of the biggest pressures is time.
Yeah.
We live in a society now where we need both parents to work for as much as possible in order to meet our basic needs, particularly during a cost of living crisis. And that means, the after school time is pushed.
And it's so interesting what you're saying, Naomi. Play Scotland was 25 years old in December last year, 2023. And the 4 key planks of what we've been trying to achieve in that 25 years have been framed really around 4 concepts of policy development, research, resources, and professional development of the children's workforce in terms of play. And what you'll notice is missing there is parents. Now, we do a lot of things to support parents, but actually we're really doing it for parents, because the challenge is, you're right, there's instrumental arguments, and we want children to be well equipped in life. There's no doubt about that. Play is essential to their development. But fundamentally, Play Scotland wants children to be able to have opportunities for free play and fun. And I think the support that parents need is more now than ever. And we talk about the state has a role to play, but I think a lot of organisations have a bigger role to play. We just haven't quite realised it. So I don't know how that translates into academic research approaches to supporting parents and to facilitate children's right to play, so that children don't weaponise it against their parents. I've got a right to play. Don't stop me playing. Don't take that den down because I have a right to play. You need to leave the den up. I think it's going to be quite a difficult one, and I do think we've got a role to play to support parents.
Yeah, I think so. And adding something onto parents' plates that are already overflowing, I think, that's not going to appeal to anybody. But I think this is where, and how to achieve this is the $1 million question. But what we need is a real cultural shift that goes back to the point, and I don't want to sound nostalgic, but goes back to the position where we were a few years ago, or perhaps a couple of generations ago, where we did just open the doors and the children could go out and play. Because actually that then introduces that peer relationships with children to support their play, also across different age groups. That then eases the pressure a little bit on parents to have to continually entertain their children or to find routes to enable free play. Because, even when we're talking about den making, that still requires, I need a bit of help, or it requires finding space to have that facilitated. So even then, when it is something that is very child-led, it still requires something of parents. But then I think it's also around framing extracurricular activities in a way that goes back to the core of what it should be, which is, as you say, fun, and removing the pressure to have to succeed in everything. And again, I see why that pressure is there. As a parent, we want the best for our children. We want them to succeed in whatever route they want to take. But if we take, for example, children's football, my son plays football on a Saturday morning. He has training on a Wednesday afternoon, but it's not fun. He wants to do it because he wants to go play football. But when you look at his face when he's doing it, it's not fun. It's highly pressured. It's, we didn't win, we need to try harder next time. Comments like, if you don't want to be here, then we don't have to be here. that's not going to provide, that's not fun for children. And so it's looking at that way of facilitating children to come together and play together to do things like football, but removing the pressure that's associated with it, which I think can only be done through educating both parents and also coaches, although generally speaking, I think coaches should be more informed around prioritizing the fun element.
It's difficult. And as a parent myself, having got notes home, I was one of these terrible parents that actually didn't go to any of the rugby or other matches. But a lot of parents did go. And I think there was a lot of concern with how parents were behaving in terms of putting even more pressure on the child and being quite abusive towards the referees. So I think you're right. And I think you really hit the nail on the head. And I think it actually says this in our legislation. It definitely, our Children's Commissioner, Nicola Clean, has also said it, that really this is a breakthrough moment in Scotland in terms of UNCRC into Scots law. But it's not just a legal framework for children's rights. It is a culture change. It's permission to change our culture is what it really is, because as we know, full implementation of children's rights can't happen through legislation. It creates the framework and the permission to do it, and the reporting framework and the guidance and the regulation. The change happens at grassroots level. Change happens with parents, with people in the community. All of us, we all are part of this change. And, another great friend of Play Scotland's, Sue Palmer, who was on our board for quite a while, and wrote books about toxic childhood and other things, was saying 20 years ago, we need a campaign for culture change. And sometimes I always thought, you're right, but actually without the legal policy framework, it can just come and go. It might not stick. And I'm really hoping now it will stick. And I think hopefully with the culture change, it will give parents permission to have less pressure. But I think there's a big responsibility for a lot of us to try and inform and shape what that culture change might look like and what success would look like. And as you were saying about your research at the beginning, you're working with 100 young people. It does take the voice of the child to bubble up through this. It's not their responsibility to make the changes, but we would like to be informed by what's happening by their voices. It's up to us to do the hard work and lead the change. But I think being informed by what children are telling us is absolutely critical.
I think it's a real benefit and a real strength that actually, when you look at the play community, there is such a wealth of experience, a wealth of knowledge, and pulling that together at this stage to look at how best we go forward, how best we progress. And I fully agree that you're right. There's a lot of pressure on Scotland right now, because if we do this right, then any implementation of the right to play will be looked upon by other countries. Actually, even if we do it wrong, it will be looked upon by other countries and might be then taken up. So there is a pressure to make sure that it's done right, and which also means there's no need to rush ahead. It's taking time to ensure that it's done properly. I think is important, although bearing in mind that there are children still today that need our help.
I think that's great. That's really good words of wisdom from you, Naomi. I very much appreciate that. If we were just to finish today's podcast, I've loved it, by the way, and I hope you'll come back and do another podcast with us along our journey, along our way at some stage. But do you have any other words of wisdom that you'd like to leave us with today, and anything you think that we should be keeping at the front of our minds as we implement the child's right to play in Scotland?
I think my main point, is probably the last one I just said, around making sure that the time is taken to do it right. I think it's very easy when new legislation like this comes through to really pick up on the hype and the excitement around it and run too fast. And it's making sure that the groundwork is there to make sure we don't trip up over any hurdles along the way that would be too damaging. And I appreciate that, yes, it would be so much better if this was a UK level legislation. But ultimately, there is an appetite for that in Westminster for England. We see more appetite in Wales, and we already have good progress there. And I think it's okay for these other nations to be pushing forward the progress, and hopefully we'll have an evidence base to say, look, incorporation has made such a difference to children's lives in Scotland. So let's do this across the board as well, but that will take time.
I think we're at the beginning of a very long process. I do feel we're at the starting line. And that's not to be, oh my goodness, it's taken us so long to get here. I don't want people to think that the journey in some way is being minimised, but it's been a long, hard journey. But in some ways, I think you're right, we're at the starting line. And it isn't about taking off at 100 miles an hour and burning out, in quick time. So yes, I think a lot of challenges. On a lighter note, Naomi, I was just thinking there, we quite often start conferences by asking people about their favourite play memories. Do you have a favourite play memory you'd like to share with us?
So I grew up both in the UK and in the Philippines. So my play experiences are quite varied. And actually in the Philippines, I had total free rein and could walk out the door and disappear off into friends' back gardens, and my mum would have to come looking for me. And then moving back to England, realising that playing out wasn't really done in the same way. But my mum was an amazing person in facilitating that by ensuring that, she would give heads up to parents that I was on my way. So still enabling that independent mobility, but doing it in a way that was culturally appropriate at the time. In terms of favourite play experiences, I think anything involving nature, that just enables you to fully... I think that freedom kicks in more when you're in a nature environment, when you're climbing a tree and you reach the top and you can see for miles and breathe in the fresh air. Just that level of freedom is so much higher than other experiences. So those are probably my favourite.
That's super. Thank you so much, Naomi, for joining us on the Play Scotland podcast today. It's been absolutely joyful to listen to your own journey, your own play journey, and the wonderful work that you're doing. And we look forward to hearing from you again in future. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us on this podcast. To find out more about Naomi's research, please follow the link in the episode information. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast on your preferred app. To find out more about Play Scotland, please follow us on Twitter @PlayScotland and visit our website at playscotland.org.